Star Wars 7 by 7 episode 3033. It's a What to Watch Sunday episode. I know normally when we do these episodes, we do them on Saturdays, but hey, let's mix it up. Why not? And we haven't yet talked about the latest installment of the High Republic show, so we're going to wrap up the big stuff that came out of this most recent installment. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7 by 7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. First off, I will say to Christina Ariel, congratulations. She's out on maternity leave, so this episode is hosted by Kristen Baver. So Christina Ariel, congratulations so much on your new arrival. I hope you and your family are all doing well. Then this episode follows mostly a similar format to other High Republic shows, although there's no recap that happens. In previous episodes, there have been recaps of what's happened in the High Republic storytelling since the previous High Republic show, but because we're just barely starting Phase 2, there's no recap there. They do have the animations, like the little 1+ minute things that give us an overview of concepts and characters and whatnot happening within the High Republic. So that was actually one of Kristen Baver's questions to Michael Siglain, whether the animations would be back, and he said yes, and they actually showed one about the Path of the Open Hand, but that was actually toward the end of the episode, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the format this time around was first a series of reveals wrapping up New York Comic Con, which we've already talked about on the podcast. Then there was a cute little video medley montage from New York Comic Con. Then a roundtable, which was probably actually the longest roundtable they've had on any of the High Republic shows. And then finally a series of art reveals. Oh, and the High Republic questions as well. So this time Kristen Baver peppering Michael Siglain from Lucasfilm with questions submitted. And actually, you know, I keep saying I'm getting ahead of myself with the Michael Siglain stuff, so why don't I just stay ahead of myself? Because one of the questions was actually rather remarkable in terms of its answer. It was about Phase 2 and about the storytelling and the way it's going to play out. And according to Michael Siglain, Phase 2 is going to be shorter than Phase 1 was. Now, I remember there being a question about whether there would be 3 waves in Phase 2 as well as Phase 1, and Kevin Scott responded and said just because there were 3 waves within Phase 1 didn't necessarily mean there would be 3 waves in Phase 2, and I guess I personally was expecting that it might be longer if it was going to be anything, but to hear that it's going to be shorter is really kind of a surprise. Although I suppose it's possible we could also be talking about the time in universe for the storytelling. It's 2 years in Phase 1. It might be shorter in Phase 2, and maybe that'll translate to less waves. I don't know, I guess we'll see. But they also talked about 2 particular battles that are going to be significant, including the Battle of Yaddle, which is going to be documented in the audiobook original by George Mann, and somewhere down the line in Phase 2, the Battle of Dalna, which was originally referred to in Justina Ireland's books in Phase 1. All right, so that's the end of me getting ahead of myself. So let's rewind back to the beginning of the High Republic show and talk about the reveals from New York Comic Con that we didn't talk about in our previous episode. Well, you know, the details of those reveals, basically. So we already know and have talked about the fact that there's going to be a manga called Precedent, which is part of the Edge of Balance series. It's going to feature Arkoff, the Wookiee Jedi, who's featured in previous Edge of Balance installments. And apparently there's going to be some explanation of a connection that he has with the Battle of Dalna and with Marchion Ro. That's coming in May of 2023. And then the Young Adult Anthology, for which there's still no official title, is coming in July of 2023. And one of the things that Kristen Baver said about that is that it's going to tie up loose ends and also deliver hints for Phase 3. Then in the video montage / medley with interviews and clips from New York Comic Con, one of the things that jumped out at me there was that Dexter Jettster is going to appear in Daniel Jose Older's run on the High Republic Adventures for Dark Horse. Then we get to the roundtable portion, which, as I said, was the longest one that they've had out of all the High Republic shows, actually. So that was kind of cool and interesting, and also that it's in person as well. There's definitely a different kind of dynamic when people are face-to-face with each other, so it was nice. Kelsey Sharp, who is a junior creative executive with Lucasfilm, was part of this. Also Rob Simpson, who's a senior editor for publishing with Lucasfilm, and Phil Shostak, who's a creative art manager with Lucasfilm, all together with Kristen Baver. And they talk a lot about Phase 2 of the High Republic and about about just the overarching idea of, what it's like to be 150 years prior to the events of the previous phase, that they were devolving some of the designs for the Jedi's costumes and outfits, and thinking about, devolving ship designs, and talking about how they were going into concept art from Rogue One for some of these other Jedi organizations, or some of these other Force organizations, I should say, and also into concept art from the sequel era for ship designs as well. They also talked about the convocation. That seems like it's going to be a really important thing in the storytelling going forward, with all of these different Force-affiliated organizations together on Jedha, and they kind of likened it to the idea of if you're, say, a valedictorian in your high school, and then you go to college, and you're just among a whole bunch of valedictorians, that folks are going to be with experts on the Force from a number of different points of view, and these points of view don't always necessarily agree with each other. And apparently the Jedi don't necessarily have the greatest reputation either, so I'm going to be really interested to see why that's the case. Like, what's happened in the years prior to this very early storytelling situation where the Jedi may not be looked upon in the nicest of lights. And there's, of course, a lot more to the discussion than we can get into on our humble little podcast, so I will link to it at the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com and in the show notes as well if you want to check it out. I think those are pretty much the highlights, and there are a couple other things I want to flag for you that came from the concept and comic book art reveals section. One of them has to do with the reveal of concept art for Yaddle, and Kristen Baver said that Yaddle is actually going to play an important part at the end of Phase 2 of the High Republic, so that is very intriguing. And she also revealed concept art for a Jedi Master Barash, who is working with Porter Engle, and presumably we will see her in the Blade comic miniseries from Charles Soule. This Jedi is particularly important because there is this thing called the Barash vow, where certain Jedi decide that if they need to get out of the Jedi Order, they take this vow where they are not going to use the Force, they are just going to live within the Force as best they can. And according to Wikipedia, there's talk of it being a kind of thing that they do as a measure of atonement, but it's not necessarily for that purpose. They can do it for other reasons as well. There's a Jedi who does it after a traumatic experience with the Drengir in the High Republic era in Phase 1. And part of what happens in the second series of the Darth Vader comics, which follows his activities right after the events of Revenge of the Sith, is that they go hunting for people who have taken the Barash vow. So there are other Jedi out there who are not active Jedi, but who escaped the Purge because they were not part of the Jedi Order. And so this has been referenced in storytelling a couple of times, and the fact that we have a Jedi Master Barash suggests that we may find out what the origin of the Barash vow is as part of this storytelling, which is pretty fascinating. And so there you go. Those are the highlights I wanted to flag for you from the High Republic show, the most recent episode. And again, I will have it linked in show notes and blog posts and all that. And that is going to do it for this episode of the show. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
Star Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.